It is my privilege and joy to continue our study about the least of these, to understand why suffering is in this earth and how we can get rid of it. We have today the subtitle Worship the Creator. In which manner does worshiping God play a role in suffering and disease? We remember that all suffering is the result of a deception that man thinketh he is someone he is not, that he is a God, and that he uses all means for himself. That's the anti-law. The law of God says everything you need is not for you. It is that you may pass it on, and by this fulfill the purpose of your life. But now everything is changed on this earth. People take all things for themselves, and they believe it's right, it's their right, it's their needs they need to have fulfilled. We remember that all righteousness is caused by a self-deception, that we believe a lie as a truth, that lie about ourselves. And out of this, we break the law. We have no capacity to trust God. And out of this, all results are injustice and unrighteousness. And the sufferings we see on this earth is the result of it. So how can we then remove unrighteousness? How can we remove suffering? The only way to remove it is to remove the cause that makes people to use the means for themselves, that they live for themselves. So we asked the question last time, what is governing the law? And today I have the same picture with the question, what is worship? Now, it's one and the same thing. Worship is trust, taking from God. Because everything we do comes out of whom do we trust. That's how we were made, and no one can change that. Every thought that we have is in dependency to the source we trust. And so if actions are the result of the thoughts, then every deed is the reaction of whom you trust. So the law governs worship. The law says you have to take from just one means. Worship is governed by the law. And we even can read that in Exodus 20, where God tells us the law. And there in the second, he says, from verse 3, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. So it's very clear. Worship is one thing, and he includes here very clear, he says in this enumerating of all those things we can worship, he says, though you said, or that is in the earth, or that is in the water under the earth. So it's a all-including message to anyone that you trust except God. That is wrong worship. So the law governs dependency, and we can only be dependent by trusts. And if we are a creature of God, we trust God, we have righteousness, and the worship is correct. But if we think we are a God, then we think we don't need to trust, but we need to trust. And so we worship Lucifer, people, animals, and graven images, whatever. Yes, they always are there they show, Buddha shows a person The serpent shows a person, the dragon, or whatever people make themselves for idols, or the calves that the different types of people did to themselves, just a remembrance of God. Today we have the saints and we worship them and all that. So people worship and trust other one than God. And even if you worship your parents or your child, you trust them, it's false worship. Jesus says, he who loves those more than me, or he does not hate to take from them, to trust them, cannot be my disciple. So it's all inclusive. Sin is one thing, trusting someone else and not God. And it doesn't matter if you don't make yourself graven images, but you trust your wife. It's the same sin like you would make graven images, because there is only one sin, and that is, whom do I trust? That is, whom do I worship? Because the one you trust, you must worship, or you worship automatically. You see, there are many ways of different types of words that the Bible uses for explaining one and the same thing. Trust is connection, binding. Worship is binding. Righteousness is binding to the right source. And unrighteousness, false worship, is binding to the wrong. It's trust into the wrong source. That's all that it matters. So we repeat that once again. If I'm a creature of God, I trust God automatically. I'm in a lawful binding. That's what God says. Then I worship God. Then I am just. I am righteous. And my actions and decisions only prove that I am just. Jesus lived according to this model. He worshipped only his Father. He trusted only him. He did not even any time trusted his mother or anyone else. That's why he lived a just life. And he could say at every moment, who can convict me of a sin? Because he could say, what I do, is that what the Father does? You see me or the Father, it's the same. Because my identity is my Father. And if we are the children of God, if we are having that identity in our hearts, that we are the adopted children of God, then our Father is our identity, because what will be seen in our lives is his life. Adam could never have done anything out of this. He had to renounce. He wanted to be a God. And then he saw that he does not need to trust anymore, but he now trusts in an unlawful binding. He now worships the devil. He worships his wife. He worships all those things around him. And he lives in injustice. And his actions just show that it is so. So there are only two wells. The one is the well of righteousness, that is the truth about ourselves. And the other is the well of unrighteousness, of false worship, of the unlawful binding, and that is, I believe I'm a God. You can never mix your actions. Every action that you do must either come from here or here. There is not a third wellspring. So we either act out of the one or act out of the other. There is none else possible. That's why it's obvious if we put the question, what needs to be done to destroy suffering, to bring suffering to an end, to bring unrighteousness to an end, we must destroy the error. But since we cannot do it, Christ came down, and we will see how he did this in our next presentations, that he became the first Adam. That is, he came into the life of Adam that he might destroy that life in order to create a new one, the second Adam, the new identity, the truth about us. That's why Jesus says, I am the truth. He shows what's the truth. He shows what was his right identity in his heart, and his actions were all clear. So we cannot, being born like this, come to this without the cross, without destroying that makes us incapable to worship God. You see, the devil has done great work. He made people to worship God out of their selfish nature. They're not even aware that they think they worship God. They fight about doctrines out of there, again, in this way and that way, but they don't understand the issue is, who are they? The issue is, who am I? And if I live like this, thinking that I owe something, thinking that anything of the means that I have are for me, or any needs that I have are for me, then I am wrong. Then I have not understood the issue. But I worship God, I go to churches, I do all those things that the heathen do and the Christian do, and they go and say they worship. But they just do outwardly something like the Hebrews in the time of Jesus. They pray and fast, like we read last time in Isaiah 58. But they have not taken out iniquity out of their hearts. So there must be, before I get a new identity, I need to remove the old. I need to remove the old. So how can that happen? Now we have put our question about righteousness, and we want to ask ourselves, how does justification work? You see, there are simple things that sometimes we are confused about, and I want to make it clear in my mind, and so I want to share it clearly also as I understand it. So how does justification work? How does the justice of God will finish and remove the injustice, and remove by that the suffering and the pain and all that exists on earth? Because it must come to an end. We have seen there's a purpose in suffering, but it's also a purpose of suffering to bring it to an end. That is, to show that in suffering there is no life possible. So how does God judge me or you or anyone else? Now we have the human justice court. And if you are accused for something, you have only two ways to get away with it. Either you are accused to have done the thing, or you are justified that you didn't do it. They're not half ways, you did it half, or yeah. And in our lessons, we study this. We'll come later to go more into the deep of this parable, where we have as a foundation for our whole study in Matthew 25, where the judgment takes place. And God separates the goats and sheep by one thing. What you have done unto these least of my brethren, you have done unto me. And that what you have not done unto these least of my brethren, you have not done unto me. There is one thing. You have done it, or you didn't do it. So the ones are put to the right hand to be saved, and the other are put to the left hand to be lost. So God's righteousness has two actions. If I'm a God, my life is an unrighteous life. And if I meet God with this, He is a consuming fire for me. I can never come before God like this. It's never possible. The result will be instant death. That's why God keeps Himself apart from us until He can show Himself one day. And on that day, I must have a clear righteousness, a clear nature, a clear truth about myself. And then His righteousness will be a life-giving source. Only this way I can live with God. So when He will show His righteousness, there are only two kinds of people. There are only two kinds of ways. The one will be condemned and the other saved, according to their righteousness. But their righteousness must be complete. It must be full righteousness. God says, and I want to read the third commandment here. We have not time to go into depth to understand, to explain all this, but the idea in the third commandment says, verse 7, Exodus, thou shalt not make the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. You know what that means? Now that we know that our problem is that we think we are gods, we take the name of God in vain by showing that we are not His children. We show that He's not our identity, even though we think we are gods. We think we are the children of God while we are doing the wrong. But God says no one can say he's a Christian or he's godlike, but he does not show it in his life. There must be complete righteousness or incomplete unrighteousness. You see, Adam did break the law in one place, which is only one place. He mistrusted God a little. But a little mistrust is a whole mistrust, because you cannot only completely trust or not completely trust. That's why it doesn't matter how much a person does wrong. If it is out of a little mistrust, and we will see out of this little mistrust how much evil have come to this earth. In this 6,000 years, what we see is disaster. And it comes because we take the name of God in vain. But God says, I will not clear him. And if you read in Exodus 34 from verse 5, and the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there with Moses and proclaimed the name of the Lord. Now we see what's that. And the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. Now you know why identity is all that matters. If God is your identity, mercy is your identity card. Long-suffering is your identity card. Goodness is your identity card. And truth of who you are is your identity card. This is the name of the Lord. Keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. We will see how he does that. But by no means he will clear the guilty. By no means he will clear the guilty. You see, there is not two ways to stand in front of God's righteousness. You either are completely righteous or completely unrighteous. There is nothing in between. So how does that look? So the principle of the judgment is clear. Righteousness will be put on one side of the scale, and on the other side will put your life, my life. I put myself so that you might put yourself there on that scale. And what are the requirements of the law? In order to pass in court, I need a just life. I need a life which has never mistrusted God. That means which never practiced false worship, thus has never made a wrong choice, and has never done any unloving deeds. Now that's the requirement of the law. That's the requirement of God's justice. If I can meet that, I can live with God. And he can show himself to me, and it will not consume me. But if not, his appearance will be a consuming fire for my life. Now, do I have this? Do I have a just life? I must confess to you, I don't. Do I have a life that never has mistrusted God? Oh, it has mistrusted God very often. But even today, I find myself daily mistrusting God. Which has never practiced false worship? No, it's very often practiced false worship, and unfortunately still until today. Thus, I have never made a wrong choice. Oh, unfortunately, I still do wrong choices. And has never done an unloving deed. Unfortunately, even today, I do unloving deeds. Then how is it then possible to come before God and be not consumed? So we have a beautiful lecture that was given to the prophet Zechariah about Joshua the high priest who returned from Babylon to rebuild the temple and the city. And here to Zechariah was shown a vision, and he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to resist him. And the Lord said unto Satan, the Lord rebuke thee, O Satan, even the Lord that hath chosen Jerusalem rebuke thee. Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire? Which fire does he mean? He is a brand plucked of the fire of the destruction of God's righteousness. Why? How was he plucked out of the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garment and stood before the angels. And he answered and spake unto those that stood before him, saying, Take away the filthy garments from him. And unto him he said, Behold, I have caused thine iniquity to pass from thee, and I will clothe thee with change of raiment. That's what Adam and Eve lost first, was their raiments. They lost their garment. They saw themselves naked after they transgressed the law. And this garment represents righteousness. Joshua has nothing to show him in front of the judge, and he would have been destroyed by fire if there would have not been made a change of raiment. And that change of raiment is, I will pass all iniquity from thee. And I said, let them set a fair mitre up in his head. So they set a fair mitre upon his head and clothed him with garments. And the angel of the Lord stood by. And the angel of the Lord protested unto Joshua, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, if thou wilt walk in my ways, and if thou wilt keep my charge, then thou shalt also judge my house, and shall also keep my courts, and I will give thee places to walk among these that stand by. Now it's very simple. It's a change of raiment. Let's see how it appeals to me and to you. This is Christ's just life, and it is my unjust life. And the only way to meet and to make the exchange of life is on the cross. On the cross, I get the just life of Christ, and he gets my unjust life. The question now is, am I now just, ready for the courts to enter? Now, if I would die in that moment, yes, but most don't die in that moment when they get new birth, because it is not in God's intention to let a person die after he was born again, because this is the new birth. That what Joshua experienced in the judgment is the new birth. He gets a new life. But that new life now, the angel of the Lord says, you must keep it. You must walk in my statutes. That is, you must practice the right worship. So, yes, everyone that got the just life of Christ is in a process, is a born-again person. But it is not in the intention of God to let such a person die. He wants that this person implements now the life of Christ, and in reality, the life of Christ must become his life, or I say it in my first person, his life must now in reality become my life. That's why, yes, God will and can save the thief on the cross because he got the just life of Christ and he had a great faith that Christ is his Redeemer. But if God could not prove in front of the universe that this man, if he would have had time to live enough to implement all those things and would have had the right circumstances, he would have become exactly one with Christ, like those who will become one with Christ, the 144,000, or like Enoch or Elijah. Because God needs a guarantee that in heaven, never again, false worship will be practiced. That in heaven, never again, a person will be able, let's see this, will be able to mistrust God. And I say it in all consciousness, what I say. In heaven, there will enter no one who has the capacity to mistrust God. Because it was never a choice to mistrust God. It was never a choice to not trust. We all need to trust. And heaven is only safe when no one is any more able to mistrust God. No one will ever be able to mistrust God. Sin, the capacity, the possibility of self-deception to think you could become a God will be forever erased from mankind. Only this way God can save. This is why we must understand the new birth is a beginning. We must have it. It's the change of life on the cross. My old man dies, and now I live a new life. Now out of this new life I can do no bad thing. I only can do bad things out of the old nature that I still have, and now I am in a battle that the new nature must take over the old, must destroy the old completely, so that every action I do out of trusting in God and not trusting anymore a human being. And so we become one with Christ. It's so important that we understand what will be put on the day of judgment on the waiter or on the scale. Will it be put Christ's life or my life? Will Christ stand on the scale? Because I saw a movie or a video clip some time ago where people coming and they are on the judgment seat of God and they must step on a scale. And they come, weighted, and they are too low. Like Belshazzar, who was written many, many tekel ufers in, weighted and found to not heavy enough. Too light. And so they all go on the site where they are going for the final judgment. And there comes a man who has done many wrong things. He has a great where he has all his bad deeds. And he doesn't step on the scale, but asks Jesus, who was sitting there or was standing, to come and step for him on the scale. And Jesus stepped on the scale, and the scale says, enough. And so Jesus steps down from the scale, takes him, and invites him into heaven. And those on that other corner said and shouted, unfair! And they are right. It would be the most unfairest thing if the life of Christ would be the life that is waited on the day of judgment. Because it's unfair. It would be unfair in any judgment that another would take the place of me in judgment. There is only a time, an intercessory time, in which grace takes the place of me. Until, and this is what we don't understand, until my life becomes one with Christ's life. Only in this way I can stand on the scale. The whole Bible, it at no place, there is no right way, even if you never read the Bible and you have only that righteousness idea in you that God put in you when He created us, you would know that it is unjust that another should be weighed on the scale. Christ takes our place in grace time that we might become like Him. So the Bible says in Hebrew, Apostle Paul very clearly writes, they were born again. They went through baptism to the Red Sea, but they did not enter the land of Canaan. Only 2 men did it who were over 20 when they left Egypt. Why? Because they were of unbelief. It's not enough to start well. You must finish well. And the finishing well is fully identification with the life of Christ. I mean, Paul writes not only in Hebrew that we must come to that place, not only in Romans, but there is one very plain writings of Paul in Colossians chapter 1 that says like this, and you know it all by heart, those who knows the Bible. Colossians 1 and it's 26. Even the mystery which has been hid from ages and from generations, but now is made manifest to His saints, to whom God would make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. That's total identification. Whom we preach, and now look what he preached, warning every man and teaching every man in all wisdom, that we may be presented every man perfect in Christ Jesus. Whereunto I also labor, striving according to His working, which worketh in me mightily. You will not find one Bible verse in which Christ will be judged in your state. But you will find, I don't know how many, where it shows that you will stand under judgment. You has to pass on the scale. We take Isaiah 58. We saw that from last time, and I want to read Isaiah 58 from verse 6. To remember, is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thy health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee, and the glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. That is, that will take you to Him. Is it speaking of Christ or of you or of me? Who has to let go? Is it Christ that has to act? Will Christ be judged in the judgment in that parable where God comes and separates the sheep from the goats? It will be proven if Christ and I am identical. It will be proven if I have implemented and Jesus and I became the same. There's a pastor who's my friend, and he doubts the idea of perfection. He doubts that at any moment my life could be like that can stand on the scale. Now, yes, I need for my past my Savior's life, but I need Him to implement everything He did in my life, to do it also. And he says, I don't believe that we can reach that state. And I said, I know why. Because you look to yourself. And when I would look to myself, I would say, Lord, that's impossible. But Jesus said, what is impossible with men is possible with God. And He answered to this question, how can we then attain salvation? So it is possible for those who have faith. And faith is trust. Faith is worshiping God. I don't believe that I ever can become like Christ, seeing what is possible. I believe it because He said it. I believe it because Enoch made it and Elijah made it, and if one made it, everyone can make it. Paul said, I have fought the good fight of faith. For me now is put aside the crown of righteousness because Christ became his life. Yes, no one can by his own merits. But without his actions, he can never stand because we have to act freely in heaven. We were made to act everyone for himself. Everyone to have the right trust and being able to govern his life perfectly. So God will never allow anyone to come into heaven except he is ready. And so he has the 144,000 as a proof that if everyone had the same chance, the same circumstances, he would have come to that place, even though he died earlier. God will prove in the judgment that that life that ended before perfection would have reached perfection if the circumstances would have been different. The thief on the cross would have reached perfection. If not, he would have never been said by Jesus, you will be in my kingdom. Because forever, the capacity, the possibility to mistrust God must be ruled out. And when Jesus is ready in his intercessory work, when he stands in between God and me just until he finishes me, until I and him become one, and he lets then the 144,000 to enter the wrath of God, the judgment of God, the fire that comes to those 7 plagues, none of them will be killed. The fire of God's wrath, that fire that cannot let the guilty stand, that cannot let the unjust be not put to death. That justice will destroy in those 7 plagues everyone that exists on earth, except the 144,000. Because that wrath would destroy anyone if there would be one little taint of false worship. So by God's grace, we are people of faith, not of looking to our possibilities. No, I don't look to my possibility to ever reach that state. But I trust my Father, I trust my Lord, that in that work where he said, Paul, I fight, in that battle, I want to reach that state that will show that my identity is my Father in heaven, that my identity is Christ, that his life and my life can now be exchanged. It would be the same way, it would be the same character. That's salvation. That is the only way to remove the unrighteousness, and it's the only way to remove evil, suffering, and death from this universe. And I hope you want to attain to that life. Amen.